Good afternoon subscribers, Geekonomics here once again, and today considering crowding out, primarily for my students who missed today's lesson. So get your notes caught up please, watch this video and catch up. I'll go into a bit more detail in this in a subsequent video, but just for the purposes of today, this is a very quick recap. Crowding out, what is it? Crowding out means that the public sector is so enormous and contributing so much to economic activity that in effect it is squeezing out any available capacity and any available room for the private sector. So the public sector crowds out the private sector is the phrase that's often bandied around, and it means that there is too much government activity going on. We got into a little bit of a political discussion with regard to left wing, right wing and politics and parties and so on. But we were talking then about the general key distinction between, say, Labour and Conservative. Conservative, of course, very traditionally, although Mrs May's speech a couple of weeks ago is slightly against this line of thinking, but Conservative values traditionally talking about the rolling back of the state. You may recall Margaret Thatcher in the 80s talking about the rolling back of the state, privatisation, privatising what were nationalised industries, and letting the private sector do the heavy lifting rather than the public sector do the heavy lifting. So very small government, not so much government intervention, and the private sector taking the strain. Whereas Labour, traditionally lots of state intervention, state ownership, nationalised industries, and a lot more government intervention. Anyway, let us now get, ladies and gentlemen, to the diagrams. So the diagrams for this are the transmission mechanism diagrams. Slightly more detail than is in your textbook, page 250 in the OCR Peter Smith textbook. But once again, I do think it's worth just giving you that little bit extra, that little bit more, that value for money indeed, ladies and gentlemen. So let me move the camera along and let us then consider the transmission mechanism diagrams. So, ladies and gentlemen, first things first, we're starting from the real economy this time and working around in an anti-clockwise direction, whereas of course before we started in the money market, then proceeded to investment market, then proceeded to the real economy. So our start point is here, AD1 at P1 and Y1. Very low level of economic activity, significant negative output gap, very substantially far away from the full employment level of output. And we then say, well, how would the government, let's say, go about narrowing that negative output gap? Well, one method, of course, is to increase the G component of AD. C to the I to the G to the X minus M. And so if that happened, AD would shift to the right. So I've shifted it away along here to the YF point just to exaggerate the effect. And we said that this would probably be arising because of the multiplier process, positive multiplier, and the accelerator process, which we've just learnt about recently, and these two things interacting together. However, we then said, well, this new level of economic activity, very high level of economic activity, full employment level of output in this model, what impact would that have on the money market? And more specifically, ladies and gents, the demand for money. Well, more economic activity, money changing hands more rapidly, the demand for money rising. Consequently, money demand curve shifting to the right. What does that do to the interest rate? Forces it up. What does that then do, ladies and gentlemen, to the level of investment? Now remember, investment is the I component within C to the I to the G to the X minus M. So investment by firms on capital equipment, very important. What will happen is, as you can see, the level of investment will be contracting. We're contracting along the investment demand schedule as the interest rate rises because, as a consequence of the government's intervention, increasing G, they have increased the cost of borrowing, and that of course then deters firms particularly from making these very substantial financially very substantial investments. And so I contracts. Well, if that is the case, that contraction in investment will partially then, not totally, certainly not the way we're analysing it here, that will partially offset the increase in G. So we've got the G rising, but the I is falling, and as a consequence we're moving perhaps not from AD1 to AD2, but maybe the overall effect would be from AD1 to AD3. So we've narrowed the negative output gap, for sure that has happened, but the extent to which that has happened because of this crowding out element is much less than we had first considered when we initially shifted AD1 to AD2. And that, ladies and gentlemen, really is crowding out in its basic form, and really the crux of the matter lies in the cost of borrowing issue here, stimulated by the increase in AD, and then because that impacts on I, would obviously impact on C as well and other components, but we're focusing here on I, AD does not shift quite as far as one might first anticipate. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is crowding out. I'll be doing another video on crowding out where I'll break this down into a more step-by-step analysis and add the various points and components as I talk through it. But for those of you who missed my lesson today, that's what you've missed. So bye for now.